Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the strange and unusual literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that booktube seems to be a big fan of, as they frequently talk about his works. I am referring to a story that is about kings, radiant knights, and war. I am referring to The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, which was published in 2010. Seriously, look at this book and look how thick it is. One of the longest books that I've read, especially for this channel. I think the longest previously was either House of Leaves or Dune, of all things. Yeah, that's a pretty lengthy book, and it's been occupying my time for the past 2 weeks. For those who don't know, Brandon Sanderson is an American author known for writing fantasy and science fiction, often blending the two together. He's noted for creating Sanderson's rules of magic, although one of the rules, the zeroth rule, is always err on the side of what's awesome. So kind of indicating that the rules don't even matter in the first place, which I'm kind of a fan of. I don't care how your magic system works as long as you tell me that it does work, and as long as you're a little bit clear about why some things can't work in there. But I don't need a deep discussion about it or something like that. Another interesting thing is that Sanderson was tapped to finish Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, which a lot of people seem to enjoy. And he's known for writing a couple of other series, including Mistborn, which I kind of want to check out, and the Stormlight Archives, which I'm talking about here today. So a pretty interesting author, although I have heard a lot of pushback against his work based on who he is as a person, or based on just not really liking how he does fantasy. I'm willing to listen to all of that and hear that, but I thought I'd still highlight one of his stories here today. Whether I do that in the future is up for discussion, but I just wanted to talk about at least one Sanderson work, as one of my friends who goes by the name of Moose. He probably has a real name, but that's his online name, has been recommending him to me lately, as well as a couple other friends. So I thought I'd discuss it here today. And so without further ado, let's talk about The Way of Kings. Obviously, my summary won't be very thorough because this is a 1,200-page book, and I don't have time to sit here and just drone on and on and on about it. So there might be a few things that I don't talk about here, but I might talk about in the analysis section, so just be prepared for that. So without further ado, let's talk about The Way of Kings. I'll do a summary, then an analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Way of Kings focuses on the fictional world of Roshar. Roshar is another planet in the Cosmere, which Sanderson frequently writes about. And Roshar has a number of kingdoms, a number of high princes ruling over those kingdoms, and a number of different people, including the Parshendi, Alethkar, the Shinovar, different places. And they all seem to fight over shard blades, which are mystical swords, mystical plates of armor that allow the wielder to be very powerful. And it basically makes or breaks kingdoms. That's what the main characters in the story are really fighting over, as Sanderson tells the story, as the narrator goes along. And it really begins about 4,500 years ago with the Knights Radiant turning their back on humanity. Why exactly they did that is not clear, but it's a question that many people seek to answer, and not only in this story but throughout the series. And so, the story kind of follows the assassination of King Gavilar, launching a war against the Parshendi, who ordered the assassination for unclear reasons, and so this leads a vengeance pact, a number of high princes, against the Parshendi, and there's a war between the common people and the the Parshendi, and they're all fighting for shard blades, and the high princes are squabbling amongst one another while the story really takes place here. One character that it follows multiple, but one character that it follows is Szeth, however you pronounce that name. He's the one who assassinates King Gavilar, and because he is a Shinovar assassin, part of the lower rungs of that society, because the warrior class is pretty low, he has an oath stone that is passed around, and whoever has it is basically his master and can order him to kill. And those people are slowly being killed off because other people want to lay claim to him because he is pretty powerful and has a shard blade himself. Eventually, he's tasked with assassinating more high princes, which is going to destabilize, or in some cases maybe stabilize, what's going on in Roshar at this time. Eventually, he makes his way to Kharbranth, a neutral city, where he finds out that King Teravingian is actually ordering these assassinations, and he's also been stealing blood from hospital patients in order to kill them, so he can figure out what visions they're seeing and try to understand that. Szeth is needless to say, pretty disgusted by all this, but he can't really do anything about it because Teravingian is his master, and as his story comes to a close, he's ordered to do an assassination on High Prince Dalinar, who is another character in this story. The story also follows Kaladin, the son of a surgeon, who becomes a warrior in order to protect his brother in a couple skirmishes that are happening in this story, and unfortunately his brother dies, and so he fights in order to protect other soldiers, but after a particularly nasty battle in which he wins a shard blade, one of the high princes betrays him and sells him into slavery so that they can have access to that shard blade, which demoralizes Kaladin and makes him feel like nothing can really get done. Eventually, he makes his place to the Shattered Plains, where the battles between the Vengeance Pact and the Parshendi are taking place. And he is made to be a bridgeman, which is viewed as expendable, and he might die. But he finds that he's surviving, and he becomes revered by his fellow bridgemen, who he's keeping alive. Eventually, he discovers that he has powers related to the Knights Radiant, and his friends help him to try to figure out how to work them and how to help others with them. And along the way, he ends up saving King Dalinar when one of the other high princes betrays Dalinar. And as his story comes to a close, it's really him trying to figure out more about these powers and what he can do to help others in the process. And then the story also follows Shallan. Shallan is a member of a royal family, but her family has come into some financial trouble, and so she seeks out Jasnah in order to become her ward. However, this is actually a trick on her part, as she actually wants to steal Jasnah's soulcaster in order to take it back to her kingdom and use it to basically create more money and resources in order to pay off the kingdom's debtors now that her father has died. Unfortunately, Shallan is poisoned by a sort of ardent monk type. Jasnah manages to heal her, but also finds out that she tried to steal the soulcaster in the process. And so Jasnah seeks to exile her and blacklist her and make her family not as powerful as it once was. But Shallan realizes that Jasnah has actually been lying, and she doesn't need the soulcaster because she can create this magic on her own, which is kind of sketchy and taboo because that's what the Voidbringers were able to do. But Shallan blackmails Jasnah into letting her tag along and continue her studies and try to figure out how the way of the world is, specifically as it relates to what happened to the Knights Radiant and who the Voidbringers were, which, as it turns out, might actually be the Parshendi. And the Voidbringers were once the destruction of humanity, and they can be in the future, so they're a little worried about what's going to happen on the Shattered Plains, and they make their way to the Shattered Plains as that story comes to a close. And then the story also focuses on Dalinar and his son Adolin, who are part of a High Prince royal family in Kholin, in this world of Roshar. And Dalinar used to be a brave, fierce warrior. He has a shard blade himself, but lately he's been losing the feel of the fight, especially as this war has been dragging on for 5 years now. And he's also been having visions, which all of that puts Adolin at unease because he can no longer feel that he can trust his father, but also he feels that other high princes might try to sabotage or even kill their family in order to gain more power. And Dalinar, because he wants to end this war, seeks to make alliances with other high princes, but they all reject him except for Sadeas, who is at least somewhat untrustworthy at first, but he slowly gains Dalinar's trust. However, unfortunately, after attacking the Parshendi in a massive battle, Sadeas betrays Dalinar and leaves him to die. Very fortunately, Kaladin ends up saving him, as I mentioned before, and they become quite close, and Dalinar even makes Kaladin and his men part of his royal guard, effectively saving him from slavery and whatnot. And then Dalinar confronts Sadeas about it, and even forces the king to make him sort of the war chief of all of this. And he plans to enact the codes, which should surely make everyone fight more valiantly and help the kingdom and unify people in the process. But as his story comes to a close, he has a vision showing the destruction of humanity in the future, with the Almighty, the God of this world, noting that odium has killed him and might in fact destroy everything else in the process. And finally, as the story comes to a close, the Herald of the Almighty, sort of like a messenger of the Almighty, shows up and is like, the final desolation comes, the Everstorm, the ultimate destruction of humanity is upon us, but someone notes that he's too late, and this is likely already begun. So it ends on a bit of a humorous, if scary note there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with The Way of Kings. There's just so much here and so much worth latching onto, mostly due to Sanderson's excellent writing, but also because of maybe some things that Sanderson didn't consider as he was writing. But one of the ideas that Sanderson is writing about here is that of the tempest, or the storm. Roshar is a violent, storm-filled place. Frequent storms roll over Roshar, destroying everything in their path that's not secured safely. Kaladin is left out in a storm, and although it normally kills most people, because he seems to have these powers, it doesn't really kill him. But he does see a weird face in the storm that's not fully explained. But it's clear that this is a very terrifying place to live. Not only with the storms, but also constant war. There's been war going on for about 5 years now. And people are being assassinated and hurt and forced into slavery, and it's generally not a good place to be. And I like how Sanderson gets at that everything about Roshar is violent and bloody, and you have to be very strong to thrive, or else you're going to die, or someone is going to take advantage of you in some way. But more so than that, the underlying sort of magical ability, or one of the magical abilities, Stormlight, in this world, is seen as a fury, as a tempest. Especially at the beginning of the story, Szeth, when he notes that he's using Stormlight to try to assassinate King Gavilar, it seems to fill him with immense strength and rage and whatnot. And there's a good quote from this that I would like to read to you. Szeth could feel the light's warmth, its fury, like a tempest that had been injected directly into his veins. The power of it was invigorating but dangerous. It pushed him to act, to move, to strike. And that's a really good quote right there, because it gets at the sort of fury, the power of the Stormlight. That not only does it make you more powerful, but you might not have, full control while you're using it. I think Dalinar even notes that it pushes him forward and forces him to fight when he's wielding the Stormlight. And so, this power that some very lucky characters can have, it makes them more dangerous in an already dangerous world. And to add on to all of this, many characters, point out that in order to survive in this world, you have to be strong in order to thrive. Kaladin notes that he wasn't strong enough to save others, and he might not even be strong enough to save himself until he realizes the power of the Stormlight within him, the power to protect others. Even Dalinar and Adolin note that if you don't, put up a strong front against the other high princes, they'll bowl over you and just straight up take over. And Shallan, she's worried that the other kingdoms will note that her father is dead and immediately try to take over in any way that they can. That there's no way that she can protect herself, and so she might end up dying. And so she's seeking Jasnah's Soulcaster in order to bring some strength to her kingdom, essentially doing an act of violence violence against Jasna in order to prevent an act of violence against herself. And I really like how Sanderson has created this violent world, and noted, in many places how there's a need for peace, that this can't go on. It might end up tearing this world apart, tearing the characters apart. And that's a terrifying, interesting kind of fact. And it might even be influenced somewhat by the reality of what Sanderson was living through at the time, given that it was 2010. Even now, I mean, we live in a violent reality. But given 2010, we were still in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and those were a perpetual war against an enemy that was seen as inferior, but was somehow defeating a stronger enemy. Maybe Sanderson saw that and at the time and was like, hey, I want to include that in my story. So some real world parallels there. Another interesting thing that Sanderson writes about here is inequality, especially in Roshar. The main kind of theme of the story seems maybe not the main theme, but a strong theme in his story seems to be the inequality, especially as it pertains to the light eyes versus the dark eyes. The racism in the story seems to be between people who have lighter colored eyes, who are on the top of society, and the dark eyes, who are in the lower rungs of this caste. And indeed, there seems to be a caste system that takes place where if you aren't from a noble family, if your family isn't doing a particularly well job in your community, you have little rights, little access to rising up through the ranks, which luckily Kaladin's father was a surgeon, so he had an opportunity for growth, which unfortunately wasn't realized, and so there's quite a bit of a difference between a person like Dalinar, who's been a light eyes and seen as very regal and has plenty of opportunities, and a person like Kaladin, who is constantly sort of spit on by society. And many of Kaladin's fellow bridgemen are experiencing that as well. This caste system doesn't really make sense to the character of Rock, who is from outside Alethkar and lives on top of the mountains with his community. He's just wondering why this caste system has to be this way. Although the other sort of societies that exist in this world have their own caste system, so it seems like inequality is kind of baked into this very world. Maybe there's nothing you can really do about it apart from fight it, which will likely get you killed. And what's worse is that the Parshendi in this story, the fated, eventually revealed Voidbringers, they're just slaves in society. They're the bottomest rungs, and anytime they try to rise up, they end up being called the Voidbringers, which isn't good. But they're just cast aside and forgotten about, and so you really see the inequality whenever people talk about the Parshendi, because they're just viewed as disposable and ignored. But one thing that's interesting is that there is an opportunity to rise up through the violence, as I mentioned before, which is claiming a shard blade or the shard armor. Because if you end up killing a carrier of the shard, someone who has a shard blade, you can claim it for yourself and rise through the ranks, and you'll supposedly be treated with equality. However, Kaladin realizes that that's not actually the case, because when he kills a shard bearer, things actually go very wrong for him, and he also feels a little bit of disgust. Allow me to read you another interesting quote from this. But the thought of touching that blade sickened him. It represented everything he'd come to hate about the Light Eyes, and had just slaughtered men he loved dearly. He could not become a legend because of something like that. He looked at his reflection in the blade's pitiless metal, then lowered his hand and turned away. And there you see Kaladin, having the opportunity to claim a shard blade and rise through the ranks, but ultimately rejecting him because it would make him just like the other Light Eyes in the story. He'd be participating in the system of inequality, and it wouldn't really help any other Dark Eyes. He wouldn't have an incentive to help the others in that case. But even then, even though he has an opportunity to claim it, High Prince Amaram just immediately betrays him and says, "Oh, I need this more than you. I can do more with it if I had access to the shard blade." So this carrot that's being dangled is actually just an illusion. Maybe many of the High Princes might not actually be as noble and willing to help those who are from the lower caste of society rise up. And what's interesting is that this might carry over to all the high princes, that some people are proclaimed to be noble, but they're actually participating in this system of inequality. And Kaladin has doubts about whether any high prince, whether anybody can be truly noble and caring of those who aren't in positions of power. And you see that through his view of Dalinar and Sadeas, whereas Sadeas is viewed as kind of a terrible slave master, and Dalinar is proclaimed as being noble and heroic, but at the same time, he's willing to work with Sadeas and including bridgemen in his army who are viewed as expendable. And he doesn't seem to really do anything about the fact that Sadeas has slaves on the Shattered Plains, and there's massive death in this war. To Kaladin, Dalinar kind of feels on equal footing there. But there is opportunity for change here, because Dalinar, when he sees that Kaladin saves him, and when he sees that to leave Kaladin and his bridgemen alone would result in their deaths after Sadeas is very angry that they saved Dalinar. Dalinar actually brings them in and makes them part of his royal guard. So there does seem to be hope, and there does seem to be change. But ultimately, I think it's clear that Dalinar is participating in this system, and that this just might be one of the few exceptions that can take place. And is change actually possible? It's a bit unclear, because on the one hand, with Kaladin maybe, but you still see the dark eyes inequality, and maybe that might change throughout the series, but it doesn't appear to be changing here. And given that the Parshendi seem to be in a permanent state of slavery, and they keep seeming to go from this slave system to rising up and becoming the void bringers and nearly destroying humanity, to going back to becoming slaves. It seems like humanity is caught in a cycle of inequality, of using these people for personal gain and then immediately regretting it. And that's a really fascinating sort of cycle that Sanderson is describing here. Although I don't normally like systems of inequality in fantasy, especially because if you're writing a fantasy world that is different from ours, why would you include a similar level of inequality and racism and prejudice? It doesn't really seem that creative. But I'm willing to ignore it here, because it's so in-depth, and Sanderson seems to be getting at a real kind of systemic problem that needs to be fixed in order for humanity to survive in Roshar. Another idea that Sanderson is writing about is deciphering the past. The many characters in the story are trying to understand the past, including Dalinar, Jasnah, and Shallan. They all seek to understand what's going on with Roshar, and understanding what happened in the past in terms of the Knights Radiant, how the Way of Kings was formed, and how what happened to the Voidbringers, what was actually the case there. They're trying to pick apart truth versus metaphor in the past, because a lot of older books will tell pretty tales about what happened in the past, but won't give you the actual truth, and you have to sort of dig through codes in order to understand that, which is something that happens in the real world, but is also happening in this book. In fact, Jasnah describes herself as a verita something or other, basically a truth teller, pouring through the history and seeing what the truth was, rather than what simply people said, and not simply accepting that as fact. Because in order to understand the past, you can understand why problems became problems, and what solutions they offered, and how they were fixed. Because Roshar seems to be running into a similar problem here of constant war, and people having visions telling them to unify the people for some oncoming threat. Understanding the past will help us better understand and decipher, and give us keys of what's going to happen in the future. But I do like that there is a human element here, sort of weaving tales about the past and metaphors, either because you're scared of what happened in the past, it might make humanity look bad, especially because we call it the Parshendi Voidbringers. We came up with a different name so that we could justify regularly enslaving them, but at the same time, enslaving them led to them becoming the Voidbringers and rising up against humanity. And so, you can hide that all you want, but if you don't tell the truth about history, you're doomed to repeat it, which is a constant fact that you see in fantasy and in the real world. So Sanderson does some good writing there that makes me more curious about how they're going to, talk about the past in future installments in this series. And there's a number of other great things about this book as well that I don't really have time to go into, but they include like Szeth being used quite frequently in the story, not really having his own agency and feeling disgusted and guilty with himself after killing all of these people. I really hope to see more of his arc and see how he progresses, because I kind of want something positive for him at the end of this, because the way things are going right now, it doesn't look good for him, and he's unfortunately being used to bring stability, as Teravingian says, but it's really only going to be destruction. And then Kaladin's guilt and his desire to help others as a result of the death of his brother, and how he doesn't really want to return home because there isn't that kind of place for him there anymore. Which you could talk about the hero's saga there, and the hero with 1,000 faces or something like that. But that's another good element of this story. And then you can also talk about The Way of Kings, which is both the title of this book, but also the name of the sort of historical document in this story, sort of like a biblical reference, a heretical biblical reference, which you could argue is like, it talks about how you need to unite the people and you need to act a certain way as a king. But you could also ask, like, are the kings in the story following the way of kings? What is the true way of royalty in this story? Is it nobility, or is it actually treachery in how Sadeas is acting? I think it's a mixture of both, but we'll see in future stories if nobility is more of a possibility as Dalinar enacts his plan to enforce the codes and enforce nobility and heroism upon the other high princes. And there's other things that I don't really like about this story, a number of problems, including the fact that Shallan seems like an afterthought in this story, kind of disregarded. There's the least amount of focus on her, and I feel like if you're going to focus this amount on her and like not a lot on her, then you could have saved her for a future story or something like that. Although it kind of does take away from the story if you don't focus on her, but still, like the little amount that Sanderson did here, it feels like there's not a lot, and it kind of distracts from the amazing things that are happening in Kaladin and Dalinar's own stories. I also think it's weird how Sanderson writes about the Parshendi treatment, because with the treatment of the light and the dark eyes, he seems to be making an actual value judgment of saying that's wrong, like that, like this is not acceptable. But with the Parshendi, they also seem to be like an afterthought, like, oh, it's he doesn't seem to be saying that it's wrong to treat the Parshendi this way, and more so because he calls them the Voidbringers, it seems like there's an indication that, oh, it's okay to slaughter these people mindlessly because one day they might rise up against humanity, and it's better that they're not there at all. And that's a real problem, kind of a genocidal problem there, and I really hope it's addressed in future sort of installments. But here it seems to just be kind of present, but not really ever addressed. It's the elephant in the room that kind of sinks the story a little bit, in my opinion. And another problem is that this seems to be an advertisement for the next book. Like it's constantly introducing new ideas and new things that probably aren't going to be explained until 1 or 2 books down the road. And I know that's kind of how fantasy is, but at the same time, like, you should address and focus on issues in a single book rather than trying to create a series out of anything. Like, we should focus on what's on our plate before eating the next meal, as they say. And that's just, I'm sure a lot of people don't have problems with that, but that's always an issue for me because, if you're more focused on the overarching series, you're not focusing on the book at hand and making a coherent sort of solid entry in the series. And I think Dune kind of gets around that, whereas this kind of sets up a lot of stuff for future books. Dune does that too, but Dune feels like a more complete kind of feel, where it's more about Paul getting back at the Empire for killing his family. This one introduces a lot of things that aren't addressed or that are kind of sitting down the road, which Dune does, but it doesn't, place it at the forefront like Sanderson does here. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Despite the many problems that I just listed, I don't want anyone to get the idea that I did not like this book. I really enjoyed it. There were a lot of really rad sections, mixed with some great world building and some quality, character exploration. And I think that's a really solid first entry into any series that's going to be continued down the road. Unfortunately, this is still a work in progress because he's been focusing on other stuff at the time. And the next series, book isn't scheduled to be released until like 2024, which is unfortunate, but be on the lookout for more videos about this book down the road. Unless, of course, people discover something horrific about Sanderson, in which case I probably won't ever talk about him again. But for the most part, I anticipate reading through this series and learning more about the world that Sanderson has created. So yeah, I definitely recommend reading this first one if you're looking for some fantasy to get into. It's pretty high quality, and it gives you a lot worth to look forward to and a lot to chew on, in addition to being awesome battle stuff and whatnot. So if you read this book before, you simply have something to say about what I said in my review here, comment below. I would love to hear from you about The Way of Kings. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. And I have a feeling that anyone interested in fantasy probably already knows about Sanderson, but you never know, just to be sure. And you can also join the Discord, which I'll put in the description, if you want to have a conversation there about Sanderson or The Way of Kings. But until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and stormlight travels. Farewell.